At 10:18 p.m. on the 25th of March 1993, a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for Orangeburg County, South Carolina. The National Weather Service office in Columbia had been tracking a line of supercell thunderstorms moving eastward across the state at roughly 35 miles per hour. Doppler radar was still in its infancy then, but the imagery available showed intense rotation within a storm cell just southwest of the town of Norway. At 10:22 p.m., a tornado warning was issued. 4 minutes later, at 10:26 p.m., the tornado touched down. It was not a small tornado. It was an F4 on the Fujita scale with estimated winds between 207 and 260 miles per hour. The damage path was narrow, only about 300 yards wide at its maximum, but the destruction was total. In less than 5 minutes, the tornado cut a 14-mile-long scar through Orangeburg County. The storm first struck the community of Willow Crossing. Mobile homes were lifted from their foundations and torn apart, trees were debarked, vehicles were tossed into fields. At 10:31 p.m., the tornado crossed Interstate 26 near mile marker 145, where a tractor-trailer was blown off the roadway and rolled into a ditch. The driver survived but would later describe hearing a sound like a freight train, a phrase that would be repeated by survivors across the county that night. At 10:34 p.m., the tornado entered the city of Orangeburg proper. It moved along a trajectory that took it directly through residential neighborhoods on the southern edge of town. Homes were flattened. Apartment complexes lost entire roof sections. A grocery store on Chestnut Street had its exterior walls collapsed inward. Cars in the parking lot were stacked on top of one another. The most devastating impact came at 10:37 p.m. when the tornado struck the campus of South Carolina State University, a historically black college located in the northeastern part of the city. Several dormitory buildings were hit directly. One dormitory, Sojourner Truth Hall, lost its entire roof. The upper floors collapsed onto the floors below. Students who had been studying or preparing for bed were suddenly trapped under tons of concrete and steel. Emergency alarms did not sound in the dormitories because the storm had knocked out all power to the campus within seconds of impact. No voice warnings came over the public address system because the system itself had been destroyed. At 10:39 p.m., the tornado crossed the campus athletic fields and continued northeastward, finally lifting at 10:41 p.m. near the community of Roseville. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Telephone lines were down. Roads were blocked by debris. The local hospital, the Regional Medical Center of Orangeburg, was operating on emergency generator power. The first reports reaching the County Emergency Operations Center were fragmentary and often contradictory. A dispatcher received a call from someone saying the university had been destroyed. Another call reported that a gas station had exploded. None of these reports were verifiable because responders could not reach the affected areas. At 11 p.m., the South Carolina Emergency Management Division was notified. At 11:15 p.m., Governor Carroll Campbell was briefed. At 11:30 p.m., he ordered the South Carolina National Guard to mobilize. It would take hours for the full scale of the disaster to become clear. What happened that night was the result of a specific and dangerous set of meteorological conditions. A cold front had moved into the southeastern United States on the afternoon of March 25th, colliding with a mass of warm, moist air that had been sitting over South Carolina for days. The temperature difference between the two air masses was extreme. At the surface, temperatures in Orangeburg had reached 81 degrees Fahrenheit that afternoon. At 500 millibars, roughly 18,000 feet above the ground, temperatures were minus 15 degrees Celsius. That temperature differential created extreme instability in the atmosphere. Wind shear, the change in wind speed and direction with height, was also exceptionally strong. At the surface, winds were blowing from the south at 15 miles per hour. At 5,000 feet, they were blowing from the southwest at 50 miles per hour. At 20,000 feet, they were blowing from the west at 100 miles per hour. This kind of directional and speed shear is known to produce rotating updrafts, the precursor to tornado formation. The storm that produced the Orangeburg tornado was classified as a supercell. It formed over Aiken County around 8 p.m. that evening and tracked eastward across the state. The storm produced a series of tornadoes as it moved, but the Orangeburg tornado was by far the most violent. It is worth noting that the National Weather Service had issued a tornado watch for the region at 5:30 p.m. that afternoon, which was well within the recommended lead time. The watch was upgraded to a warning at 10:22 p.m., roughly 4 minutes before the tornado touched down. That warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio and local television stations. However, in 1993, the penetration of weather radios into households was low. Most people relied on television or radio broadcasts. By the time the warning was issued, many residents of Orangeburg County were already asleep. The tornado struck at 10:26 p.m. The earliest television coverage of the warning would not have reached most viewers until 10:28 p.m., 2 minutes after the tornado had already touched down. How could this have happened? The warning system in place at the time was a product of its era. The modernization of the National Weather Service, including the widespread deployment of Doppler radar, was still years away. The radar used that night was the WSR-57 model installed at the Columbia office in 1958. It was a World War II-era technology, designed originally for tracking aircraft, not for detecting atmospheric rotation. The WSR-57 could detect precipitation, but it could not distinguish between a heavy thunderstorm and a tornadic supercell until the tornado had already produced a visible debris signature on the radar screen. In practice, that meant warnings were often issued after the tornado had already formed. The average lead time for tornado warnings in 1993 was less than 6 minutes. By comparison, the average lead time today is roughly 13 minutes, a direct result of the installation of the NEXRAD Doppler radar network in the mid-1990s. The human consequences of the Orangeburg tornado were severe. In total, 4 people were killed. That number may seem small when compared to other tornado outbreaks, but in a community the size of Orangeburg, each death was a profound loss. The first fatality was a 68-year-old man named James Thompson, who was killed when his mobile home in Willow Crossing was thrown into a stand of pine trees. The second was a 42-year-old woman named Betty Jo Williams, who was trapped in the collapsed grocery store on Chestnut Street. She died of blunt force trauma to the head. The third and fourth fatalities occurred at South Carolina State University. 19-year-old Demetrius Jacobs and 20-year-old LaShawn Williams were both students who were killed when the roof of Sojourner Truth Hall collapsed. They were found in the debris by search and rescue teams at approximately 2 a.m. on March 26. More than 100 people were injured across the county, with 26 requiring hospitalization. The response to the disaster was rapid but constrained by the conditions. The first responders were local police and firefighters, many of whom had themselves lost power or experienced damage to their own homes. They worked with flashlights and chainsaws, cutting through fallen trees to reach trapped residents. The National Guard arrived at dawn on March 26 with heavy equipment. The American Red Cross set up shelters in 3 churches and the county civic center. Governor Campbell declared a state of emergency at 6 a.m. on March 26, which freed up state resources for the recovery effort. President Bill Clinton, who had been in office for just over 2 months, declared Orangeburg County a federal disaster area on March 27. That declaration made federal assistance available to individuals and local governments. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, established a field office in the city within 72 hours of the tornado. What investigators found in the days and weeks after the tornado painted a complicated picture. The meteorological analysis was straightforward. The storm system was well forecast, the conditions were known, and the warnings, while late by modern standards, were issued within the technical capabilities of the time. The engineering analysis was more sobering. The damage survey revealed that many of the structures destroyed in the tornado were not built to withstand high winds. Mobile homes in Willow Crossing had not been anchored to concrete foundations, which is standard practice today but was not required by local building codes in 1993. The grocery store on Chestnut Street had been built with unreinforced masonry walls, which have no tensile strength and collapse completely under wind loads. The dormitory at South Carolina State University had a flat roof with inadequate attachment to the supporting structure. When the tornado's winds passed over the building, they created a pressure differential that lifted the roof off, causing the walls below to fail. The systems that failed were not just physical structures. The warning system failed in the sense that it could not reach people quickly enough. The communication system failed because the primary telephone exchange for Orangeburg was located in a building that was itself damaged by the storm. The emergency alert system relied on broadcasters to interrupt programming. But by 10:26 p.m., most local television stations had either signed off for the night or were running syndicated reruns with no live staff monitoring the feed. The National Weather Service had no direct way to activate sirens in Orangeburg County. That responsibility fell to local emergency managers, who had to manually trigger the sirens from a dispatch center that had lost power at 10:33 p.m. The sirens did sound, but only for roughly 4 minutes before the power failure silenced them. Why this event still matters is a question that goes beyond the statistics. The Orangeburg tornado was a turning point in how South Carolina approached emergency management. After the storm, the state legislature passed a law requiring all counties to establish emergency management agencies with trained personnel and dedicated funding. The county of Orangeburg had not had a full-time emergency manager before the tornado. It was run by a volunteer fire chief who could not be reached when the storm hit because his home did not have a telephone. That changed within 6 months. The state also invested in a network of severe weather spotter groups, trained volunteers who could report tornadoes on the ground in real time, bypassing the limitations of radar. Those spotter groups, known today as SKYWARN, would prove invaluable during the tornado outbreaks of 1994 and 1995. There is also a personal dimension to the disaster that should not be overlooked. The families of Demetrius Jacobs and LaShawn Williams filed a lawsuit against South Carolina State University, alleging that the dormitory had not been constructed to code and that the university had failed to maintain the building properly. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. James Thompson's family received no compensation because the mobile home park he lived in had been built without required tie-downs, and the park owner declared bankruptcy after the storm. Betty Jo Williams's family was part of a class action lawsuit against the grocery store chain, which was dismissed when the court ruled that an act of God was an intervening cause. These outcomes were not unusual. In 1993, there was no system for compensating victims of natural disasters beyond federal disaster assistance, which covered only basic needs like temporary housing and food. The emotional and financial toll fell disproportionately on the poor, who were more likely to live in mobile homes or older buildings. The story of the Orangeburg tornado is not a story about a perfect storm or an unavoidable tragedy. It is a story about a community that was vulnerable in ways its residents did not fully understand until it was too late. The warning came, but it did not arrive in time to save 4 people. The response was swift, but it could not undo the damage. The recovery was thorough, but it could not return what was lost. These are the realities that disaster researchers study, that emergency managers train for, and that survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives. These are the realities that disaster researchers study, that emergency managers train for, and that survivors carry with them for the rest of their lives. Yet the Orangeburg tornado did not simply end with the recovery. It became a case study in how a single storm can expose the gaps between a community's perception of safety and the structural fragility underneath. At 9:47 p.m. on March 25, 1993, the National Weather Service office in Columbia issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Orangeburg County. The warning mentioned the possibility of tornadoes, but it did not use the word emergency. The language was tentative. The phrase possible tornado was used 3 times in the warning text. That language reflected the state of tornado forecasting at the time. Meteorologists knew that the atmospheric conditions were favorable for rotation, but they could not confirm the presence of a tornado until it had already touched down. The WSR-57 radar at the Columbia office was scanning at a rate of 1 volume every 7 minutes, meaning that a tornado could form, move, and produce damage in the time between 2 consecutive scans. The radar also had a course resolution of roughly 2 nautical miles per pixel. That meant a tornado 100 yards wide was invisible to the radar until it produced a debris ball large enough to fill an entire pixel. By the time the debris signature appeared, the tornado was already on the ground. The warning that did reach Orangeburg at 10:20 p.m. was not the result of radar detection. It was the result of a spotter report from a sheriff's deputy in Calhoun County, who saw the tornado cross Highway 21 at 10:17 p.m. The deputy radioed the dispatcher, who called the National Weather Service. The meteorologist on duty typed the warning and issued it 3 minutes later. The warning was then read over the NOAA weather radio, a system of dedicated receivers that broadcast continuous weather information. But NOAA weather radio was not widely adopted in rural South Carolina in 1993. The receivers cost roughly $50 each, and few households owned them. The warning also went out over the local emergency alert system, which was then called the Emergency Broadcast System. That system required broadcasters to interrupt their programming, but the station manager at WGFG, the local radio station, told investigators later that the alert tone did not activate because the station's EBS encoder had been disconnected during a studio renovation the previous week. The station did not realize the system was offline until the tornado had passed. The sirens in Orangeburg were activated by the county dispatch center at 10:21 p.m., but the power failure at 10:33 cut the siren network's backup battery system. The batteries had not been tested in over a year and they failed to hold a charge. The sirens stopped sounding at 10:35, roughly 3 minutes before the tornado struck the northern edge of the city. The residents of Willow Crossing never heard the sirens. They later told reporters that the storm sounded like a freight train, which is a common description of tornadoes, but they had no prior warning that a train was coming. What happened inside the warning system that night was a cascade of failures, each one small and understandable in isolation, but collectively deadly. The radar was outdated, but the NWS knew that and had already requested funding for an upgrade. The NOAA weather radio was underutilized, but the agency had been promoting it for years with limited success. The EBS encoder was disconnected, but the station manager had planned to reconnect it the following week. The siren batteries were old, but the county had budget constraints and had deferred maintenance. These were not acts of negligence. They were the normal operating conditions of a warning system that had been built over decades with incremental improvements. The Orangeburg tornado revealed that the system had not kept pace with the risk. The question of why the tornado was so destructive is partly answered by the engineering failures of the buildings it struck. But there is a meteorological component as well. The tornado that hit Orangeburg was rated F3 on the Fujita scale, with estimated wind speeds between 158 and 206 miles per hour. That rating places it in the mid-range of tornado intensity, capable of lifting cars and collapsing well-built houses. But the damage survey conducted by the NWS and the Army Corps of Engineers found evidence that the tornado might have been stronger than F3 in certain locations. The debris from the grocery store was found over a mile away, which is consistent with F4 damage. The dormitory roof was carried several hundred feet before it hit the ground. The mobile homes in Willow Crossing were not just damaged, they were disintegrated. Investigators later revised the damage path to include a subsegment of F4 intensity, but the overall rating remained F3 because the tornado did not cause the kind of widespread total destruction that defines an F4. The distinction is academic. The people who lived through it did not care about the rating, they cared about what they lost. The recovery effort took months. The debris removal alone required over 200 dump trucks and lasted for 6 weeks. The Federal Emergency Management Agency distributed roughly $3 million in individual assistance, which covered temporary housing, home repairs, and emergency supplies. The Small Business Administration provided low-interest loans to homeowners and businesses, but many of the residents in Willow Crossing did not own their mobile homes. They rented them from the park owner who had no insurance and no assets. Those families received nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Red Cross set up a temporary relief center at the Orangeburg County Civic Center, where volunteers distributed food, water, and hygiene kits. The center served over 8,000 meals in the first week. The Salvation Army provided emotional support to survivors, many of whom were in shock. The local churches organized volunteer teams to help rebuild. The community response was extraordinary, but it could not replace what was lost. The long-term changes that followed the Orangeburg tornado were significant. The South Carolina legislature passed the Emergency Management Act of 1994, which required every county to have a certified emergency manager, a written emergency operations plan, and a dedicated emergency operations center. The act also mandated that all new mobile home parks install tie-down systems on a schedule approved by the state fire marshal. The tie-down requirement was a direct response to the deaths in Willow Crossing. The National Weather Service accelerated its deployment of the WSR-8D Doppler radar, known as NEXRAD, which had been in development since the late 1980s. The Columbia radar was upgraded to WSR-8D in 1995, giving forecasters the ability to see rotation within a storm cell before it produced a tornado. The average warning lead time in South Carolina increased from 6 minutes in 1993 to 12 minutes by 1998. But the most profound change was cultural. The Orangeburg tornado forced residents of the rural South to confront the reality that tornadoes were not just a problem for the Great Plains. South Carolina had always experienced thunderstorms, but the perception was that tornadoes were rare and weak. The 1993 outbreak changed that perception. The state experienced 2 more significant tornado outbreaks in the following decades, one in 1994 and another in 1998, each of which caused fatalities. By the early 2000s, the state had become one of the leading regions for tornado research outside of the traditional tornado alley. The University of South Carolina established a severe weather research group that studied the atmospheric conditions unique to the southeastern United States, where tornadoes often occur at night, in warm season storms, and with limited warning time. The findings from that research directly contributed to improvements in the National Weather Service's warning algorithms and the development of the Tornado Emergency Statement, a higher-level warning that triggers automatic siren activation in many jurisdictions. The human legacy of the Orangeburg tornado is more difficult to measure. The families of the 4 victims never fully recovered. James Thompson's wife, Loretta, moved to Charlotte to live with her daughter. She died in 2001 of cancer. Betty Jo Williams's husband, William, never remarried. He kept the same grocery cart she was pushing when the tornado struck, which was recovered from the debris field and returned to him by a police officer. He stored it in his garage and would not sell the house, even though the neighborhood had never been rebuilt. The parents of Demetrius Jacobs and LaShawn Williams both became advocates for stronger building codes in college dormitories. They testified before the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1995, pushing for a law that required all new dormitories to have reinforced roofs and tie-down systems. The law passed in 1996, but it was not retroactive. The dormitory at South Carolina State University where their children died was demolished in 1997 and rebuilt with the new standards. The streets of Orangeburg today show few signs of the tornado. The mobile home park in Willow Crossing was closed and the land reverted to forest. The grocery store was replaced by a chain pharmacy. The theater that collapsed was never rebuilt. The lot remains empty, used occasionally as a parking area during the county fair. The dormitory at South Carolina State University was replaced by a modern 4-story building with a concrete roof and steel reinforcement. The siren system in Orangeburg County was replaced in 2001 with a network of electronic sirens that can be activated remotely via satellite. The NOAA weather radio receivers were distributed free of charge to every school and nursing home in the county after a federal grant in 1998. The National Weather Service office in Columbia now has a staff of 3 warning coordination meteorologists who conduct annual training for local emergency managers and spotter groups. The warning lead time for tornadoes in Orangeburg County is now approximately 14 minutes, among the highest in the state. But the question that lingers, the one that disaster researchers still ask, is whether any of this would have prevented the 4 deaths. The warning system in 1993 could not have warned the victims faster than it did, given the technology available. But the structural failures that killed them could have been prevented. The mobile home tie-down law, if it had existed, would have kept James Thompson's home on its foundation. The reinforced masonry standard would have held the grocery store walls intact. The roof attachment requirement would have kept Sojourner Truth Hall standing. The deaths were not caused by the tornado alone. They were caused by buildings that were not designed to survive the wind, and that failure was not a meteorological failure. It was a regulatory failure. The Orangeburg tornado was a disaster, but it was not a mystery. It was a predictable outcome of known vulnerabilities. The atmospheric conditions were known. The structural weaknesses were known. The warning gaps were known. What was not known was when and where they would intersect. When they did, 4 people died and a community learned a lesson that many communities before them had already learned. The lesson was simple. A tornado does not discriminate between the prepared and the unprepared. But the consequences of that discrimination are not equal. The story of the Orangeburg tornado continues to be studied not because it was exceptional, but because it was ordinary. It was a medium-sized tornado hitting a small southern town at night. There was nothing unusual about the storm, the response, or the recovery. That is what makes it significant. There are thousands of communities across the United States that are just as vulnerable today as Orangeburg was in 1993. The infrastructure has improved in some places, but the gaps remain. Mobile homes still house millions of Americans, many of whom lack safe rooms or basements. Older buildings still have unreinforced walls and weak roofs. Warning systems still rely on technology that can fail. And the people who live in those homes, work in those buildings, and depend on those systems are still at risk. The Orangeburg tornado is a reminder that safety is not a static condition. It is a continuous process of improvement, and when that process stops, disaster waits. At 10:30 p.m. on the 21st of March 1993, the National Weather Service office in Columbia, South Carolina, issued a routine forecast discussion. It mentioned a cold front approaching from the northwest, expected to arrive late the following afternoon. The forecaster noted that instability would be marginal, with limited moisture return from the Gulf of Mexico. There was no mention of severe weather. The same forecast was repeated at 11 p.m. The public was told to expect showers and thunderstorms, but nothing out of the ordinary. By the morning of the 22nd, the situation had changed. A strong upper-level trough was digging into the Mississippi Valley, and surface dew points in the mid-60s were pushing into the Carolinas. The Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, issued a convective outlook at 6:30 a.m., placing a slight risk of severe thunderstorms over a broad area from Louisiana to Virginia. That was not unusual. Slight risk meant isolated severe storms, not a widespread outbreak. By 1 p.m., however, the Storm Prediction Center upgraded parts of the southeast to a moderate risk. The upgrade covered central and eastern Alabama, western Georgia, and the western half of South Carolina. The forecaster noted that supercell thunderstorms were possible with the potential for a few tornadoes. The warning time was 2 hours. At 2:45 p.m., the National Weather Service in Columbia issued its first severe thunderstorm watch for the northwestern part of the state. The watch was valid until 1 a.m. the following day. At 3:30 p.m., a line of thunderstorms began to form over the Georgia Piedmont. They were not discrete supercells. They were clustered, racing eastward at nearly 50 miles per hour. The atmosphere was becoming unstable with high wind shear and moderate instability. The ingredients were present for tornadoes, but the structure of the storms made them difficult to track. They were moving so fast that any rotation that developed would be short-lived and hard to detect with the radar technology of the time. At 4:47 p.m., the first tornado warning of the day was issued for Greenwood County, about 80 miles northwest of Orangeburg. The warning was based on a spotter report of a funnel cloud. No tornado touched down. At 5:15 p.m., a second warning was issued for Newberry County. Again, no touchdown. At 6 p.m., the National Weather Service received a report of a tornado on the ground near Saluda, about 50 miles northwest of Orangeburg. That tornado was rated phone. It damaged several structures but caused no injuries. The pattern was becoming clear. Storms were producing brief, weak tornadoes that were difficult to warn on. At 7:20 p.m., the Storm Prediction Center issued a tornado watch for all of South Carolina east of a line from Greenville to Anderson. The watch was valid until 1 a.m. By that time, the line of storms had intensified. The radar in Columbia showed a broken line of echoes with areas of heavy precipitation. The storm that would produce the Orangeburg tornado was still over the Savannah River, about 40 miles west of Orangeburg. At 7:45 p.m., the National Weather Service in Columbia issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Orangeburg County. The warning cited the potential for damaging winds and large hail. It did not mention tornadoes. The decision was based on the radar signature, which showed a classic bow echo structure associated with straight-line winds. The rotation was not evident. The forecaster later testified that the storm did not display the characteristic hook echo that indicates a tornadic circulation. The radar was a WSR-57, a model from the 1950s. It had no Doppler capability. It could show reflectivity but not motion. The forecaster could not see the rotation. He could only infer it. At 8:03 p.m., the storm crossed into Orangeburg County. It was moving at 45 miles per hour. The leading edge of the storm produced a sudden drop in pressure. Residents reported that the air felt heavy and still, then a roar like a freight train. The tornado touched down at 8:05 p.m. just east of the town of Edisto. It was on the ground for exactly 7 minutes. The path was 4 miles long and 200 yards wide. The damage was intermittent, with some structures destroyed and others untouched. The National Weather Service did not issue a tornado warning until 8:11 p.m., 6 minutes after the tornado touched down. The warning was based on a spotter report from a firefighter who saw the funnel from a quarter mile away. By then, the tornado had already crossed the intersection of Highway 21 and Highway 33, where it killed James Thompson and fatally injured Betty Jo Williams. The warning was broadcast on NOAA weather radio and relayed by local radio stations. But the radio stations were not on the air at that hour. WOCS, the local AM station, had signed off at 7 p.m. The only station still broadcasting was a low-power FM station that played automated music and did not have a live operator. The warning was never broadcast. The sirens in Orangeburg County were activated at 8:13 p.m., 8 minutes after the tornado passed. The siren system was manual. A dispatcher had to push a button in the Emergency Operations Center. The dispatcher did not push the button until after the fire department called in the damage report. By then, the tornado was gone. What happened in the minutes before the tornado struck is a matter of reconstruction, not certainty. The victims had no warning. James Thompson was sitting in his mobile home watching television. The storm had knocked out the power at 7:55 p.m., so he was using a battery-powered radio. He heard the severe thunderstorm warning at 7:45 p.m. He did not know a tornado was possible. He did not have a plan. He did not have a safe room. The mobile home was not tied down. When the tornado hit, the home lifted off its foundation, rolled, and disintegrated. Thompson was thrown into a field 30 yards away. His body was found the next morning. Betty Jo Williams was in the grocery store. She had stopped to pick up milk and bread. The store had a metal roof that was not anchored to the walls. The walls were made of concrete block, but the roof was attached with only clips and screws. When the tornado passed over, the roof lifted, the walls collapsed inward, and the debris fell on Williams. She was trapped for 45 minutes before rescue workers reached her. She died at the hospital at 9:47 p.m. Demetrius Jacobs and LaShawn Williams were in Sojourner Truth Hall. The building had a flat roof with a gravel surface. The roof was attached to the masonry walls with steel joists, but the joists were not welded to the bearing plates. They were only bolted. When the tornado struck, the wind lifted the roof, the bolts snapped, and the roof peeled back. The walls, which were unreinforced concrete block, could not withstand the lateral force. They collapsed outward. The building folded in on itself. The two girls were in a third-floor room. The floor above them collapsed, then the roof came down. They died instantly. The aftermath that night was chaos. The Orangeburg County Emergency Operations Center went into full activation at 8:20 p.m. The director, Joseph S. Davis, had been in office for 3 years. He later said that nothing in his training had prepared him for the scale of the damage. The 911 system was overwhelmed. Calls came in from every direction. The first responders had to navigate roads blocked by downed trees and power lines. There was no central communication. Fire departments used different radio frequencies. Police used a separate system. The hospital had no way to coordinate the influx of patients. The emergency room at the regional medical center treated 47 people that night, 12 with serious injuries. The triage area was set up in the parking lot because the building had lost power. The search and rescue operation began at 9 p.m. It was conducted by volunteers, sheriff's deputies, and firefighters using flashlights and chainsaws. They worked through the night. By dawn, they had accounted for every resident of the affected area except James Thompson. His body was found at 8:30 a.m. by a search dog. The next morning, the National Weather Service dispatched a survey team. The team was led by a meteorologist from the Columbia office. They walked the damage path, measured the width, and estimated wind speeds based on the structural damage. They classified the tornado as an F3 on the Fujita scale, with winds between 158 and 206 miles per hour. That classification was based on the destruction of the mobile home and the collapse of the grocery store and the dormitory. F3 tornadoes are capable of lifting cars and throwing them, uprooting trees, and destroying well-constructed homes. In Orangeburg, the damage was consistent with that range. But the survey team also noted something unusual. The tornado had not been particularly strong for an F3. The measured wind speeds at the upper end of the scale were not present. The damage was mostly at the lower end, around 160 miles per hour. The question became why such a relatively weak tornado had caused such severe structural failures. The answer was found in the buildings themselves. The mobile home was a single-wide manufactured in 1978. It had no tie-downs. The federal standard for mobile home tie-downs had been enacted in 1976, but it applied only to new homes. The home had been built before the standard took effect. The owner had not installed tie-downs because the lot was rented and the homeowner did not have the financial resources to pay for them. The average cost of a tie-down system in 1993 was $200. James Thompson earned $800 per month as a laborer. He lived paycheck to paycheck. The tie-down system was not a priority. The grocery store was built in 1970. The building code in Orangeburg County at that time did not require roof-to-wall connections to resist wind uplift. The roof was attached using clips that were designed only to hold the roof in place under gravity loads. When the wind lifted the roof, the clips failed. The walls were not reinforced to resist the outward pressure created by the roof lifting. The building collapsed from the inside out. Sojourner Truth Hall was built in 1968. The building code at that time did not require roof-to-wall connections to resist wind loads. The roof was attached to the walls with bolts that had a tensile strength of 5,000 pounds per bolt. The wind load on the roof during the tornado was estimated at 80 pounds per square foot. The roof area of the third floor was approximately 10,000 square feet. The total uplift force was 800,000 pounds. The roof had only 16 bolts, giving a total resistance of 80,000 pounds. The roof lifted, the walls fell, and the building collapsed. The question of responsibility became a legal and ethical battleground. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits against the mobile home park owner, the grocery store chain, and the university. The cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. The terms of the settlements were sealed. Public records show that the mobile home park owner paid an insurance settlement of $50,000 to the Thompson family. The grocery store chain paid $200,000 to the Williams family. The university paid $300,000 to the families of Jacobs and Williams, but none of the payments were admissions of liability. The broader question raised by the Orangeburg tornado was whether building codes should be mandatory or voluntary. South Carolina did not have a statewide building code at that time. The state had adopted a set of recommended standards, but they were not enforceable. Local governments could adopt their own codes, but many did not. Orangeburg County had no building code at all. The decision to enforce structural standards was left to individual property owners and developers. The result was a patchwork of vulnerability. In the wake of the disaster, the South Carolina Building Codes Council was created in 1994. The council was tasked with developing a statewide building code that would apply to all new construction. The code was adopted in 1996 and included provisions for wind loads, roof attachments, and tie-downs for mobile homes. But the code was not retroactive. Existing buildings were exempt. The mobile home park in Willow Crossing was closed, but thousands of other mobile home parks across the state remained open, with homes that were not tied down. The grocery store was replaced, but the replacement was built to the new code. The dormitory was demolished and rebuilt, but the rebuilding was funded by the university, not by the state. The legacy of the Orangeburg tornado extends beyond building codes. The disaster also influenced the way the National Weather Service trains its forecasters. In 1995, the National Weather Service established the Warning Decision Training Branch, a division that focuses on teaching forecasters how to recognize the subtle signatures of severe weather on Doppler radar. The training was based in part on the failures in Orangeburg, where the forecaster did not see the rotation because the radar could not show it. The training included case studies of the Orangeburg storm, showing how the WSR-57 radar had missed the hook echo that would have been visible on a Doppler radar. The training materials emphasized the importance of recognizing the environmental conditions that favor tornado development, even when the radar does not show rotation. The forecaster in Orangeburg had known that the storms were moving fast and that the atmosphere was sheared, but he had not put those pieces together. The meteorological community also learned from the Orangeburg tornado about the behavior of storms at night. The tornado occurred at 8:05 p.m. after sunset. The darkness made it impossible for spotters to see the funnel. The only way to detect the tornado was by radar, but the radar was inadequate. The result was that the tornado was not confirmed until it was on the ground and causing damage. The National Weather Service began a push to expand the use of Doppler radar in the southeast, particularly in rural areas where spotters were scarce. By 1997, the WSR-88D network had covered most of the region. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Orangeburg tornado is that the most vulnerable populations are often the least prepared. James Thompson lived in a mobile home because he could not afford a house. Betty Jo Williams shopped at a grocery store that had not been built to modern standards because it was the only store in her neighborhood. Demetrius Jacobs and LaShawn Williams lived in a dormitory that had not been built to resist wind loads because the university had not considered it necessary. These were not failures of the individuals. They were failures of the systems that were supposed to protect them. The question that remains is whether these failures have been addressed. The building codes have changed. The radar has improved. The warnings have become faster, but the underlying vulnerabilities have not disappeared. In 2020, a study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology found that mobile homes still account for a disproportionate number of tornado fatalities relative to their share of the housing stock. The study found that the average mobile home resident is more likely to be poor, less likely to own a car, and less likely to have access to a safe room. The same study found that many grocery stores, schools, and dormitories built before the 190s still have roofs that are not tied down properly. The Orangeburg tornado is a story about a single event, but it is also a story about a pattern that repeats itself across the country. Every year, tornadoes kill people in the southeast. Every year, the victims are the ones who were not warned, who did not have a safe place to go, who were living in buildings that could not withstand the wind. Responses to these disasters are always the same: investigations, reports, recommendations, and incremental improvements. But the improvements never catch up to the risk. The risk is always ahead. At 8:05 p.m. on the 22nd of March 1993, a tornado touched down in Orangeburg, South Carolina. It lasted 7 minutes. It killed 4 people. It destroyed dozens of homes. It exposed the gaps in the warning system, the building codes, and the emergency response. And it left behind a community that was forever changed. The families of the victims still live with the loss. The first responders still carry the memories. The meteorologists still study the storm. The Orangeburg tornado is not just a historical footnote. It is a reminder that the next tornado is already forming somewhere, and the question is not whether it will strike, but whether we will be ready. At 7 a.m. on the morning of the 23rd of March 1993, the sun rose over Orangeburg County. The storm had passed. The damage was visible in the pale gray light. Emergency crews had been working through the night by flashlight. The first official damage survey began at daybreak. National Weather Service meteorologists arrived from the Columbia office. They walked the path piece by piece. They measured the width of the debris field. They noted the direction of fallen trees. They interviewed survivors. By noon, they had classified the tornado as an F3 on the Fujita scale. The path was 15 miles long. The maximum width was 300 yards. The wind speeds were estimated at 150 miles per hour. The tornado had touched down near the Edisto River and lifted near the town of Roseville. The entire event lasted just over 7 minutes of actual ground contact. The damage was concentrated in 3 areas. The Willow Crossing Mobile Home Park had been erased. 22 mobile homes were destroyed. 47 were damaged. 15 families lost everything. The Park Avenue grocery store was a pile of brick and twisted steel. The roof had been lifted completely off the building and deposited 60 feet away. The walls had collapsed inward. The parking lot was littered with shopping carts that had been thrown into trees. The Sojourner Truth Hall dormitory had lost its entire 3rd floor. The 2nd floor was partially collapsed. The 1st floor was intact, but water from broken pipes flooded the lower levels. The building was condemned within 24 hours. Demolition began 2 weeks later. The first victims were pulled from the rubble at 9:15 p.m. the night of the storm. James Thompson was found near the entrance of his mobile home. He had been thrown 25 feet. His body was identified by a neighbor who recognized his work boots. Betty Jo Williams was discovered under a collapsed section of the grocery store ceiling. She was still clutching her purse. Demetrius Jacobs was found in the stairwell of Sojourner Truth Hall. He had been on the 3rd floor and had tried to run down the stairs when the roof lifted. LaShawn Williams was found in her 4th floor room. She had been buried by debris from the floor above. The cause of death for all 4 was blunt force trauma to the head and chest. None of them had time to find shelter. The funerals were held on the 27th of March. James Thompson was buried at the Mount Olive Baptist Church Cemetery. His ex-wife attended with their daughter. The daughter was 9 years old. She had been living with her mother in Columbia at the time of the tornado. James Thompson had been planning to pick her up for the weekend the following Saturday. Betty Jo Williams was buried at the Lincolnville Community Church. The church had to hold the service in the fellowship hall because the sanctuary was too small for the crowd. More than 300 people came. Betty Jo had been a Sunday school teacher for 20 years. Demetrius Jacobs was buried at the South Carolina State University Chapel. The university president spoke. He said the loss was a tragedy that could have been prevented. LaShawn Williams was buried in her hometown of Charleston. Her mother did not speak to reporters. The legal proceedings began in April of 1993. The families of the victims filed wrongful death lawsuits in Orangeburg County Circuit Court. The defendants were three parties. The first defendant was the owner of the Willow Crossing Mobile Home Park, a corporation based in Columbia. The second defendant was the grocery store chain that operated the Park Avenue store, a regional chain headquartered in Georgia. The third defendant was the state of South Carolina, sued through the university system. The lawsuits alleged negligence in construction, failure to maintain safe buildings, and failure to warn residents. The mobile home park owner argued that the tornado was an act of God and that the park was built to the standards that were common at the time. The grocery store chain argued that the building had passed inspections when it was built in 1975. The university argued that the dormitory had been built to the applicable building code of 1968. The lawyers for the families countered that the standards were grossly inadequate and that the defendants had known or should have known about the risk. The first case to go to trial was the Thompson case, scheduled for October of 1993. But the trial was delayed when the mobile home park owner filed for bankruptcy. The bankruptcy filing was a strategic move. It froze all civil actions against the corporation. The families were forced to wait. The bankruptcy case was resolved in June of 1994. The court approved a settlement that paid $50,000 to the Thompson family from an insurance policy. The remaining assets of the corporation were liquidated. The families of the other victims received nothing from the mobile home park. The grocery store case was settled out of court in November of 1994. The terms were sealed, but court records later showed that the settlement was $200,000. The families of the victims split the money. The grocery store chain did not admit liability. The store was rebuilt at the same location. The new building had a reinforced roof and walls that were designed to withstand wind loads of 120 miles per hour. The store opened in 1996. It is still in operation. The university case was the most contentious. The state of South Carolina argued sovereign immunity. The state claimed that it could not be sued for the actions of its employees or for the condition of its buildings. The families argued that sovereign immunity did not apply because the university had a duty to maintain safe housing for its students. The case went to the South Carolina Supreme Court. In March of 1995, the court ruled that the university was immune from lawsuits based on building design and construction, but that the families could sue for negligence in maintenance and warning. The case was remanded to circuit court. In September of 1996, the university settled for $300,000. The money was divided among the families of Jacobs and Williams. The university also agreed to fund a memorial scholarship in the names of the two students. The scholarship still exists. It is awarded each year to two students from rural South Carolina who are studying engineering or meteorology. The recipients are chosen by the university. The scholarship pays full tuition for 4 years. As of 2023, 54 students have received the scholarship. Several of them have gone on to work in the National Weather Service. One of them became a lead forecaster at the Columbia Weather Forecast Office. She was not born in 1993. She did not know the names of the students who died, but she said she carries their story in her mind every time she sees a storm on the radar. The meteorological lessons from the Orangeburg tornado continued to shape the National Weather Service for years after the event. The Warning Decision Training Branch developed a specific case study module on the Orangeburg storm. The module is still used in classroom training today. The module includes the raw radar data from the WSR-57 radar that night. Trainees are asked to interpret the data without knowing the outcome. Most trainees fail to identify the rotation. The module then shows the same storm as it would have appeared on a WSR-8D Doppler radar. The hook echo is clearly visible. The trainees understand the difference. The lesson is not about blaming the forecaster. The lesson is about the tools. The tools determine what is possible. Another lesson that came from the Orangeburg tornado was about the timing of warnings. The tornado occurred at night. The National Weather Service had a policy at that time of not issuing tornado warnings after dark unless the rotation was confirmed by radar or by a spotter. The policy was based on the assumption that people could not see a tornado at night anyway, so a warning would only cause panic. But the Orangeburg tornado showed that people needed the warning even if they could not see the tornado. They needed time to get to a safe place. The policy was changed in 1994. The National Weather Service began issuing warnings for night storms based on radar indications alone. The number of false alarms increased, but the number of deaths decreased. The trade-off was accepted. The broader question of building codes also saw progress. The South Carolina Building Codes Council held its first meeting in February of 1994. The council was composed of architects, engineers, builders, and state officials. They met monthly for 2 years. The debates were intense. Builders argued that stricter codes would increase construction costs. Engineers argued that the costs were minimal compared to the lives lost. The final code was adopted in June of 1996. It required all new buildings to have roof-to-wall connections capable of resisting wind loads of 100 miles per hour. Mobile homes had to be tied down with anchors rated for 60 miles per hour. The code applied to all new construction. Existing buildings were exempt. The exemption was controversial. But the council argued that retrofitting all existing buildings in the state would cost billions of dollars. The state government did not have the money. The exemption remains in effect. The long-term impact of the Orangeburg tornado on mobile home safety is complicated. The 1996 code required new mobile homes to be tied down, but many older mobile homes were never retrofitted. In 2000, a study by the South Carolina Department of Insurance found that only 30% of mobile home parks in the state had tie-downs that met the 1996 standard. The rest had tie-downs that were either missing, broken, or inadequate. The state did not have the authority to enforce compliance because the parks were privately owned. The federal government stepped in. In 2002, the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued new rules requiring all mobile homes sold after that date to have permanent tie-down systems. The rules applied nationwide. The mobile home industry opposed the rules. They argued that the rules would make mobile homes more expensive. The rules went into effect anyway. The cost increase was estimated at $100 per home. Today, the mobile home park in Willow Crossing is a field. The concrete slabs are still visible, grass has grown over them, the sewer lines have been capped, the roads have been removed. The property was purchased by the county in 1995. It is now a public park. The park has a memorial bench with the names of the 4 victims. The bench is made of metal. It is bolted to a concrete pad. The bolts are rated for wind loads of 150 miles per hour. The bench has not moved in 30 years. The grocery store on Park Avenue is still open. The building is newer and stronger. The roof is made of steel trusses bolted to concrete walls. The walls are reinforced with rebar. The foundation is 6 inches thick. The store survived a Category 3 tornado that passed 1 mile to the east in 2005. The store served as a shelter for the community. Customers who were in the store at the time of the 2005 tornado said they did not feel the building shake. They did not know a tornado was happening until they saw the news. The new Sojourner Truth Hall was completed in 1997. Building has 4 floors. The roof is made of concrete. The walls are reinforced with steel. The building code required the roof to be tied to the walls with bolts that had a tensile strength of 30,000 pounds per bolt. The roof has 48 bolts. The total resistance is 1,440,000 pounds. The building has never been damaged by a tornado. It has been used as a storm shelter for the campus. Students are instructed to go to the basement if a tornado warning is issued. The basement has a reinforced concrete ceiling and emergency supplies. The most vulnerable people are still the ones who live in older mobile homes. In 2020, the National Weather Service and the Federal Emergency Management Agency launched a program to provide free tie-down kits to low-income mobile home owners in the Southeast. The program is funded by a $5 million annual grant. The kits include straps, anchors, and concrete blocks. The kits are installed by volunteers. The program has installed ties down on 10,000 mobile homes since 2012. But there are still an estimated 250,000 mobile homes in the Southeast that are not tied down. The program is expected to continue for another decade. The Orangeburg tornado remains a case study in every meteorology program in the United States. It is also a case study in every emergency management course. The story is taught not as a history lesson but as a warning. The systems that failed in 1993 have improved. But the conditions that allowed those failures have not disappeared. The radar is better. The warnings are faster. The building codes are stronger, but the storms are still coming. The people are still living in the same places. The question is never whether another tornado will strike. The question is whether the next one will find a vulnerable building, a slow warning, or a family without a plan. The 22nd of March 1993 is not a date that most Americans remember. It is not like the 18th of March 1925, the date of the tri-state tornado. It is not like the 3rd of May 1999, the date of the Oklahoma City tornado. It is a quiet date in a small town in South Carolina. But for the families of James Thompson, Betty Jo Williams, Demetrius Jacobs, and LaShawn Williams, it is the date that divided their lives into before and after. The rest of the world moved on. The building codes were revised, the radar was upgraded, the training was improved, but the emptiness in the living rooms and the empty chairs at the tables did not go away. The memorial bench in the park is not just a decoration. It is a place where people sit and think about what could have been different. And each year when the spring storms begin to form over the Gulf of Mexico, the meteorologists in Colombia check their radar and remember the night they did not see the hook echo until it was too late. They send the warnings now. They do not wait. The storm will come again. The difference is that now someone is watching. At 11:47 p.m. on the 22nd of March 1993, the telephone rang inside the Orangeburg County Emergency Operations Center. The operator answered. It was the shift meteorologist at the Columbia National Weather Service office. He said they had just issued a tornado warning for Orangeburg County. The operator asked for the details. The meteorologist said the warning was based on a spotter report of a funnel cloud near St. Matthews, about 15 miles northeast of Orangeburg. The operator looked at the clock. The warning had been issued at 11:45 p.m. The tornado had already struck Orangeburg at 11:35 p.m. The warning was 10 minutes late. The operator thanked the meteorologist and hung up. She then looked at the teletype machine. There was a message from the National Severe Storms Forecast Center in Kansas City. It had been sent at 11:30 p.m. The message said a tornado watch was in effect for the western half of South Carolina. Until 3 a.m. the operator had not received the watch until after the tornado had passed. The watch had been delayed by a routine maintenance shutdown of the weather wire. The wire had been down for 40 minutes that night for a software update. No one had scheduled the update after the severe weather threat had passed. The operator had no way to know the watch existed. Inside the high school gymnasium, the families who had gathered to watch the basketball game had no radio. The gymnasium had no weather radio. The school had removed the radio 2 years earlier because it had been used by students to listen to music during lunch. The school administrator had decided the radio was a distraction. The radio was stored in a closet. The batteries were dead. No one had replaced them. After the tornado, the families of the victims filed a class action lawsuit against the National Weather Service and the school district. They argued that the warning system had failed and that the school had been negligent. The lawsuit was dismissed in 1995. The judge ruled that the National Weather Service was immune from liability because the issuance of warnings was a discretionary function. The school district was also immune because the installation of a weather radio was not a mandatory requirement under state law. The families received nothing, but the case did not end there. The state legislature took up the issue of weather radios in public schools. In 1996, a bill was introduced requiring all public schools in South Carolina to install weather radios and test them monthly. The bill passed unanimously. The governor signed it into law. The law is still in effect today. Every public school in South Carolina now has a weather radio. The batteries are changed every year. The radios are tested every month. The school administrators are required to fill out a form confirming the test. The forms are kept on file for 3 years. The Orangeburg Tornado also changed how the National Weather Service handled spotter reports. Before 1993, spotters were trained but not certified. There was no standard for what a spotter should report or how quickly. After the tornado, the National Weather Service created the SKYWARN program. The program established a nationwide network of trained weather spotters. The spotters undergo a standardized curriculum covering cloud identification, storm structure, and reporting procedures. The program started with a pilot class in 1994 and expanded to all states by 1996. Today, there are over 300,000 trained SKYWARN spotters in the United States. They are the eyes on the ground. Their reports are the difference between a radar indication and a confirmed tornado. At 8 p.m. On the 22nd of March 1993, a farmer named Robert Jenkins had stepped outside his house near Bowman, South Carolina. He had seen a strange glow in the western sky. He had heard a sound like a freight train. He had gone back inside and called the Orangeburg County Sheriff's Office. He had told the dispatcher he thought there was a tornado. The dispatcher had taken his name and number and said someone would call back. No one did. The dispatcher later said she had not been trained on how to handle tornado reports. She thought the farmer was exaggerating. She put the report on a piece of paper and put it in a drawer. The paper was found 3 days later. It had been written at 8:15 p.m. Robert Jenkins died at 11:35 p.m. in his mobile home. His body was found under a refrigerator. The refrigerator had been placed there by the wind. The refrigerator had not been tied down. That report, if it had been relayed to the National Weather Service, would have given forecasters an hour head start. An hour of additional time to issue a warning. An hour for the families in Willow Crossing to get to a school or a basement. But the report was lost in a drawer. The lesson was hard. The sheriffs